Welcome to my latest batch of Ninny reviews, where I review 7 films in the time that it would normally take me to review one. Over the past few weeks, I've been slowly barreling my way through another bunch of films on my various streaming platforms just so I could do another one of these videos. And now I am ready. I am going to be taking these films in the exact order that I saw them. Most of these are standalones. I think one of these films went on to have a couple of sequels, but most of them are one-offs. Some of them are quite old, some of them are quite new. So let's get into it, starting with this one. This is a Mario Bava film, I think the first of his that I've ever seen, and if that's the case, then I'm going to have to make an effort to watch more of his, because this was excellent. In fact, I think we're front-loaded today, because I don't think there are any other films in this video which are going to score as highly as this one. It's sort of a film that's split into two halves. So in the first half, it's a bit like a slasher film. You've got these group of youths who go to this abandoned beach house near a lake, and they start to get picked off one by one. And then in the second half, it turns into more of a giallo film with new characters coming into the mix, and you're not quite sure who's going to off who from scene to scene. It's all very mysterious. But on the whole, the overall experience is absolutely top-notch. The only thing I don't like is the ending. There's this really silly final bit just before the credits, which I personally would have taken out, but on the whole, this is a really terrific film. A couple of things of note. Firstly, Claudine Auger is in this film. She was Domino in Thunderball. Now, I'm a big James Bond fan. I've been watching Thunderball my entire life, so to finally see Claudine Auger in something else apart from Thunderball was a pleasure for me. I think A Bay of Blood came out in 71 and Thunderball came out in 65, so probably when A Bay of Blood came out, Claudine Auger was probably just starting to move away from her sort of pin-up model sort of days, but she's really good in this film. And the other thing to note is that there's a kill in this film which is just like the spear kill from Friday the 13th Part 2. You know, when Jason comes up to the two lovers in the bed and puts a spear right through the middle of two of them. That was originally done in A Bay of Blood, and it's done better in A Bay of Blood, actually, because you get to see more of the kill. You get to see more of the after effects with the two bodies sort of writhing around, and clearly these two characters have no idea what's just happened to them, and they're in their final sort of death twitches. And it's not a coincidence that I'm mentioning that word, because this film apparently has an alternative title, The Twitch of the Death Nerve, or something like that. I've probably got that completely wrong, but in any event, the bed kill is better in this film than it is in Friday Part 2. So I think in the future, I would definitely like to get this film for my shelf. It's a really good one. I'm going to give it 4 out of 5. This is a lesser known film. I think it's Australian. So the story involves this young couple who go caravanning in the woods somewhere. They're not expecting to see anybody, I don't think, but this other caravan turns up and parks in the same clearing as theirs, and it's full of these weird hillbillies. Some of them are girls. There's this one girl who's got bandages all over her face because I think it's implied that she was a burns victim or something. There's this other girl who's really promiscuous and is just flirting with every sentence that she comes out with. And there's this guy who acts really hard, but he's got like painted fingernails. They're just complete freaks. But at first, they're all right. They act nice, and the two groups of people come together and share a couple of beers around the campfire, but you know it's not going to last. But this film did go down a completely different avenue than what I was expecting. I was expecting that, you know, the protagonists to end up in the woods trying to hide from these people, and it would go from there. Just be a straightforward sort of slasher film set in the woods that takes place over a 24-hour period. Not the case. There's this quite original story actually involving pregnancies, and the whole plot ends up taking place over several months, which I did not expect. There's a lot of captivity in this film. I don't usually like horror films where the good guys are held captive for long stretches, but I didn't mind it in this film just because it was a story that I've not really seen before. It is a very cheap production. At times, the lack of budget really shines through. There's a fight at one point, and I swear to God, the light changes drastically in the middle of the same fight. It's like the two characters were punching each other, and the director said, "Cut, we'll just take a break there." And then in about half an hour, they resumed, but the light was totally different. It's really noticeable. And there are other points in the film where I think that the script could have been a bit better here and there. The villains are quite good, though. And there's this additional villain who turns up about 10, 15 minutes from the end, which I did not expect. So it turns out that this group of freaks have got this matriarch mother figure, and when she turns up, she's even worse than the villains we've just spent most of the film with. She's a absolutely despicably horrible woman. She really is. She's probably worse than Pamela Voorhees. She's that bad. So on the whole, I quite enjoyed this film. It's really rough around the edges, but purely because of just how original it is, I quite enjoyed it. And the best character in the film is the girl with the bandages on her face. She's neither good nor bad. She's just, it's kind of grey as to whether she's going to end up with the villain on the villain's side or on the good guy's side. So yeah, I quite enjoyed this one. I'm going to give it 3 out of 5. It's not one that I'm ever going to buy, but certainly it's definitely worth a stream. This one's probably the worst film that I'm going to be talking about today. It doesn't even have a great title. I mean, I'm pretty sure there have been other films in the past called Getaway or The Getaway, and it started off so well because just after I put it on and the actors' names were coming up on the screen, I noticed that Scout Taylor Compton's name came up, and I was like, oh, she's in this, great, because I love her as Laurie in Rob Zombie's Halloween films, but I've never seen her in anything else. So when I realised that she was in this, I thought, oh, great, I'm really going to find this absolutely fascinating. So she's one of a group of 3 women who were on this boozy night out, and this is the best part of the movie, the first half an hour, just watching the interactions of these girls. The other 2 women whose names I do not know, they're really good as well. All 3 of these women are really fun to watch. But then when the horror kicks in, things go downhill. So there's a couple of hillbillies who basically slip this date rape drug into one of the girls' drinks, and at an opportune moment they kidnap her. And at this point, the other 2 women disappear from the film for the longest time, and one of those women is Scout. But once we get a handle on what these bad guys are all about, the film goes downhill then, because they're such bozos. They're just not great villains at all. Now, like the previous film I was talking about, the story doesn't end up going where you think it's going to go. There's all this stuff that comes into the equation that you don't expect about witchcraft and the devil, and things are definitely not as they seem in this movie. I'm not going to spoil it if you haven't seen it, but the original things that the film tries to do don't quite work for me, and the villains are just so bad. And in the end, there's quite a few different tones creeping in the last sort of 15-20 minutes. There's a bit of black comedy. It feels a bit rape revengey as well, even but there's no rape in it, I'll tell you that, but it just has that feel about it, and it just doesn't quite work for me. The tones are just all over the place, and I was a little bit bored by the time I got to the end. So I'm going to give Getaway 1.5 out of 5, just because I did enjoy watching these 3 women on their fun night out in the beginning of the film, but that's not saying much, is it? So one to avoid this one. This is the first of 2 films today done by Tygon Productions, a company from the 60s and 70s. It's not a supernatural sort of film. The title is misleading. It's a very human slasher killer that we have here. The story involves a group of youths who were at a house party back in the 1960s, somewhere in London, but they get a bit bored halfway through the night. They've done this thing a million times before, so they decide to go to this abandoned mansion that they've heard about. Yeah, it's that kind of setup, but the movie doesn't give you what you think it's going to give you. That seems to be quite a theme today in this compendium of reviews. Lots of films that show you one thing and then give you something else. This is another one. So normally in this kind of slasher film, the killer will be ultra efficient. He or she will kill most of the characters. They'll always know where to go in a building or a house to stay undetected. They'll always know what to do at certain times until they get to the final girl or the final couple of characters, and then things will go wrong for them. Now, what this film does is try to be more of a realistic slasher film and let things play out as maybe it would in real life. So what that means is that the killer cannot get round and kill most of the people and play the perfect game. They just can't do that. They end up killing 1 or 2 people, and then things don't quite go very well. The characters are not all trapped in this place for some dumb reason like they would normally, that they can sort of come and go throughout the film, and characters who just decide to leave and never come back are pretty much safe. It's a weird film to watch because it does feel like you're watching how a slasher film would play out for real. So if that appeals to you, the chance to see something like that, then by all means give this film a watch. On the downside, the fact that it's a more realistic type of film did mean that I felt like there wasn't enough excitement in it. I kind of felt like somebody had given me some cheesecake and then taken it away from me halfway through eating it. It was that kind of feeling. And the best thing about the film really is getting to see all these characters on their night out. The same with the previous film, which isn't ideal. The horror should really be the best part of the film, but certainly it was an interesting one. I did enjoy watching it. It reminded me of another British film from around about that period, Deathline from '72, I think, which promised you cannibal fun in the underground rail tunnels of London, and actually just gave you a much more subtle experience with not actually that much going on in it. But sometimes those sort of films can be good too. This is a good one. I'm going to give it 3 out of 5 just because of how interesting it is. Finally, a more conventional film, which is just a case of does what it says on the tin. I'd actually intended on doing a full review for this at the time that I put it on to watch it. I've been doing quite a lot of slasher film reviews from the golden generation period of the early 80s recently. Hell Night and The House on Society Row would be examples of two that I've done in the past month alone. But once I'd watched Slumber Party Massacre, I didn't really feel inspired to do a long talk about it. It's a very bare bones slasher film. It is a good one. It's just very, very thin. You know, it's basically 90 minutes of a bunch of girls in a house. Well, they're in a school for the first 10 minutes, but for the most part, they're in a house at a party. Every so often, somebody shows their flesh, and every so often, somebody gets killed, and that's basically it. There's no frills, no spills. That's what you get. Even the killer it's a look that's been put together in 2 minutes. There's no mask. It's just some bloke in denims. There's nothing distinguishable about him. But you know what? This very simplistic approach that they've gone in this works really well. It sometimes you just want to watch a slasher film, and this absolutely gives you that. I've no real interest in watching the two sequels. Apparently they are different from this in subtle ways. The same killer does not come back for the second film, so I've heard, but I enjoyed this. It's got some good kills in it. The characters are just fun. I had a good time, and it didn't bother me that it was such a simple affair. So I'm going to give this 3.5 out of 5. I think from all those slasher films that came out in the early 80s, I wouldn't call this one of the best, but I'm reckoning that if you watched all of them, then you would consider this to be at least above average for that sort of era. I wouldn't rush out and buy this, but if I came across it in a shop one day and I saw it, I would absolutely just pick it up and say, come on then, you're coming home with me. I'll watch this one again in the future for sure. So here's that other Tygon Productions film. This is a period piece horror film from the 18th or 19th century. Most of it takes place in this one little village with about 50 or 100 people in it. It's sort of a folk horror scenario with lots of witchcraft and stuff. It reminds me of that Robert Eggers film The Witch, actually, except in this one there's more characters, more going on, a bit more scope to proceedings. It's a very convoluted plot, I've got to say. I didn't actually understand what was going on for quite a long time. There's stuff to do with monster fur and weird rituals and characters acting in odd ways. There's multiple villains, multiple characters. Whoever wrote this clearly had some confidence in what they were doing, because I mean there are people who come into the story for like 10 minutes and then disappear, and then quite late in the day there are new characters being introduced who are very important. There's this one blonde girl who, as a villain, is just every guy's worst nightmare, it has to be said. I think this film is one of those that would be better on a second viewing, so at some point I think I am going to watch it again, but it's a highly recommended one, this. It's got a good atmosphere to it. 3.5 out of 5. So this is the sequel to the original Unfriended, which I covered back in my original batch of mini reviews. That film had a really cool gimmick, but was let down by having a supernatural killer. I think if you're going to do internet horror, you've got to have real people behind it all, not make it a ghost in the machine thing. Thankfully, this sequel fixes that problem, so I enjoyed this one more as a result. For the longest time during this, I was on the edge of my seat. It's fast moving, it's creepy. I was thinking 4 or 4.5 out of 5 at one point, but like with the first film, the last 20 minutes just let it down, albeit for different reasons this time. And I think the biggest issue I had is that the villains turn out to be a lot more far-reaching than I originally pictured. I mean, they're basically like Spectre at the end of this. They're just this worldwide organization which are all powerful. The characters in this film just never had a chance. I pictured something a lot more smaller scale, albeit still very professional. The other problem I had is that the film needed to come out of the looking through a screen gimmick about halfway through this. There was this film once that I watched called Rec 3, which started off found footage, but then it had the confidence to change things up after 20 minutes and become a more conventional horror film because the story required it. I think Unfriended Dark Web needed to make a change halfway through. It needed to switch conventions because there comes a point in this, just like in the first film, where I'm thinking to myself, these characters would just not still be sat at the laptops. They would have run off by now. So it needed to be a horror film of two halves, and we just don't get that. So I'm going to give the film 3 out of 5, but this is what I would call a disappointing 3 out of 5 based on where I was with it after an hour. So that's it, that's all for today. That's 7 more films covered in my pursuit through the world of horror throughout my lifetime. I'll be back soon with another group of mini reviews. Cheerio.